Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive not into the elegant tea ceremonies or the valor of samurai warriors, but into the precarious, often terrifying, daily existence of an ordinary resident in 18th century Edo, Japan, the city later known as Tokyo, a place constantly living under the dual specter of devastating fires and earth-shattering quakes. That romanticized image of cherry blossoms, refined arts, and a perfectly ordered society? Well, the unvarnished truth for those packed into its sprawling wooden confines was a life punctuated by sudden alarms, frantic escapes, and the ever-present possibility of losing everything to flame or tremor. And frankly, your modern disaster preparedness and building codes would seem an almost unimaginable safeguard. So find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. Your world is a city of wood and paper, a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million souls, one of the largest on the planet. Edo, in the heart of the Tokugawa shogunate, is a place of vibrant commerce, intricate social codes, and breathtaking artistry. But beneath this glittering surface lies an ever-present fragility. Your house, like almost every other commoner's dwelling, is constructed primarily of timber, bamboo, clay, and paper shoji screens, materials that offer little resistance to the twin terrors that define life here: fire and earthquake. The very fabric of your city makes it a tinderbox, a stage for recurrent catastrophe. The term flowers of Edo doesn't refer to cherry blossoms, not primarily. It's a grimly poetic euphemism for the frequent massive fires that sweep through the city, consuming vast swathes of wooden neighborhoods and terrifying conflagrations. These aren't occasional accidents. They are a recurring feature of urban existence, so common that they shape the city's layout, its architecture, and your very mindset. You live with the constant low hum of anxiety about the next spark, the next gust of wind that could turn your world to ash. Imagine the density of your neighborhood: narrow, winding streets, packed tightly with wooden houses, shops and workshops, their eaves almost touching. A dropped lantern in a paper-strewn workshop, an overturned brazier in a cramped tenement, a spark from a bathhouse chimney, any of these can be the genesis of a disaster. Winter, with its dry air and the increased use of heating fires, is an especially perilous time. The wind, funneled through the narrow alleys, can turn a small blaze into an inferno within minutes. When the alarm is raised, the frantic ringing of fire bells from watchtowers, the shouted warnings of kajida, fire, a primal fear grips you. There is no organized, citywide fire department as you would understand it. Firefighting is largely the responsibility of local neighborhood groups. The haichi, composed of artisans and labor, often fiercely competitive and more adept at demolishing surrounding buildings to create fire breaks than at extinguishing the blaze itself with their primitive hand pumps and water buckets. Their efforts are brave, but often woefully inadequate against a major firestorm. Your first instinct is to save what little you can: a futon, a few precious tools, perhaps a small chest of clothes. But time is desperately short. The roar of the approaching fire, the heat, the choking smoke filled with burning embers, create a scene of unimaginable chaos. People scream, push and stumble through the narrow streets, desperate to escape the encroaching flames. The weak, the elderly, and the very young are at greatest risk of being trampled or overcome. The scene is a vision of hell. The night sky glows in unnatural, terrifying orange. Burning debris rains down, igniting new fires. The crackle and roar of the flames, the crash of collapsing buildings, the cries of the trapped and the bereaved. These sounds form a symphony of destruction. You run, your lungs searing, your eyes stinging, driven by the most basic instinct: survival. The flowers of Edo are blooming, and they are terrifying. If your home is in the path of the fire, you will likely lose everything. The flimsy wooden structures are consumed with astonishing speed. You might watch from a safe distance, perhaps a wide riverbank or an open field designated as a fire refuge, as your neighborhood, your possessions, your memories, are turned into a smoldering ruin. The sense of loss, of utter desolation, is profound. And even if your own dwelling is spared, the disruption to your life is immense. Whole districts are wiped out, markets are destroyed, disrupting food supplies. Artisans lose their workshops and tools, their livelihoods gone in an instant. The city's intricate social and economic fabric is torn apart and must be painstakingly rewoven. For days, even weeks, after a major fire, the air is thick with the smell of charred wood and despair. Rebuilding is a constant cycle in aid. No sooner has a district been consumed by fire than the resilient citizens begin to clear the rubble and erect new, equally flammable, wooden structures. There is a fatalistic acceptance of this impermanence. Fires and quarrels are the flowers of Edo, the saying goes, a testament to the city's volatile nature and its inhabitants' stoic, or perhaps resigned endurance. Your life is lived with the knowledge that what you build today might be ashes tomorrow. Then there is the other great terror, earthquakes, or Jishin. Japan lies on a nexus of tectonic plates, and Edo is no stranger to the Earth's sudden, violent convulsion. While smaller tremors might be a frequent, unsettling occurrence, a major earthquake brings a different kind of horror, one that can strike without warning, day or night, turning the solid ground beneath your feet into a treacherous, heaving sea. The experience of a powerful earthquake is terrifying. The ground begins to tremble, then to lurch and shake with increasing violence. Buildings sway precariously, their wooden frames groaning and cracking. Roof tiles crash to the ground. The noise is deafening, the roar of the earth, the crash of collapsing structures, the screams of terrified people. You cling to whatever solid object you can find, or rush into the narrow streets, hoping to avoid being crushed by falling debris. In a city built of wood and paper, earthquakes are often a prelude to another, even greater disaster. Fire, overturned braziers, broken lanterns and collapsed kitchen hearths can ignite the shattered buildings, and soon, a firestorm can rage through the very areas already devastated by the quake. The firefighters, their equipment perhaps damaged, or their water sources disrupted, are even less effective than usual. It is a double dose of catastrophe. The aftermath of a major earthquake is a scene of utter chaos and devastation. Streets are blocked by rubble. Houses are tilted at crazy angles, or have collapsed into piles of splintered wood. The cries of those trapped beneath the debris, or those searching for missing loved ones, fill the air. The ground might continue to shudder with aftershocks, prolonging the terror and hampering rescue efforts. If your home is near the coast of Edo Bay, a major earthquake also brings the terrifying possibility of a tsunami, or a great wall of water, generated by the undersea upheaval, can sweep inland with devastating force, destroying everything in its path, drowning those unable to reach higher ground. This adds another layer of dread to the already precarious existence of coastal community. The lack of scientific understanding of these phenomena means that earthquakes and fires are often attributed to supernatural causes, the wrath of angered gods, the thrashing of a giant catfish, namazu, believed to live beneath the earth, or imbalances in cosmic force. People resort to prayers, charms and rituals, seeking to appease these unseen powers or to divine when the next disaster might strike. These beliefs offer a semblance of meaning, but no real protection. The social order can break down in the immediate aftermath of a major disaster. With food and shelter scarce, and law enforcement capacity stretched thin, looting and violence can erupt. Desperate people do desperate things. Rumors spread like wildfire, often blaming minority groups or outsiders for the catastrophe, leading to scapegoating and further injustice. Fear and uncertainty can bring out the worst in human nature, yet, you also witness incredible acts of resilience, compassion, and community spirit. Neighbors help each other to douse small fires, to rescue the trapped, to share meager supplies of food and water. Temporary shelters are erected. Guilds and neighborhood associations organize relief efforts. There is a shared understanding of suffering, a collective will to survive and rebuild, that is a hallmark of Edo's character. The government, the Tokugawa shogunate, implements various measures to try and mitigate fire. Fire watchtowers are erected. Fire lanes and wider streets are mandated in some rebuilt areas. Strict regulations govern the use of fire. Yet, the sheer density of the wooden city, and the limitations of pre-modern firefighting technology, mean that these efforts are often only partially successful. The flowers of Edo continue to bloom with alarming regularity. Your daily life is lived with an acute awareness of these dangers. You learn to sleep lightly, ready to flee at the first alarm. You keep a small bundle of essential possessions ready. You know the quickest escape routes from your neighborhood. You participate in local fire drills or watch duty. This constant vigilance is a mental burden, an undercurrent of anxiety that shapes your every day. The construction of your home reflects this perilous reality. It is designed to be easily rebuilt, perhaps even dismantled and moved if necessary. Interior walls are often sliding paper screens, offering little structural integrity but allowing for quick escape. There is a sense of impermanence, of transience, built into the very fabric of your dwelling. Your home is a temporary shelter, not a lasting fortress. The smell of smoke is a constant in Edo, even on days without a major conflagration. The air carries the scent of countless cooking fires, bathhouse chimneys, and small industrial forges. But when a true fire alarm sounds, the smell changes, becoming acrid, choking, filled with the specific terrifying odor of 1,000 burning homes. It is a smell that sears itself into your memory. The economic impact of these recurrent disasters is enormous. Fortunes are lost over. Artisans lose their tools and workshops, merchants lose their inventory, families are rendered destitute. Yet, the rebuilding process also creates work for carpenters, roofers, and laborers. It is a cycle of destruction and reconstruction, of loss, and for some, a precarious opportunity. The city's authorities might issue edicts and regulations after each major disaster, aimed at improving safety or controlling rebuilding, but these are often difficult to enforce, or are circumvented by a populace desperate to re-establish their lives and livelihood. The fundamental challenges of a massive, densely packed wooden city in an earthquake-prone region remain. Consider the simple act of heating your home, or cooking your food. Every charcoal brazier, every kitchen fire, is a potential source of disaster. You learn to be meticulously careful, to never leave a fire unattended, to ensure sparks are contained, but accidents happen. A gust of wind, a moment of carelessness, and tragedy can strike your household or your neighbors, quickly engulfing your shared world. The psychological stress of living under such constant threat must be immense. You might develop a stoic, fatalistic attitude, an acceptance of the inevitable, or you might live in a state of heightened nervousness, startled by every sudden noise, every flicker of an unattended flame. Some might turn to drink, to gambling, to the fleeting pleasures of the floating world, ukiyo, as a form of escape. The art of the period, the ukiyo wood-blocked prints, sometimes depicts these disasters: fires raging through the city, people fleeing in panic. These images, while stylized, offer a glimpse into the visual reality of these catastrophes, a shared cultural memory of the city's vulnerability. They are a testament to the profound impact of fire and earthquake on the Edo consciousness. The rebuilding process itself is a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of Edo's people. Temporary shacks spring up amidst the ashes almost immediately. Carpenters and laborers work day and night. The sound of hammers and saws replaces the roar of flame. There is a communal effort to restore a semblance of normalcy, to reclaim the city from the ashes, even knowing that the cycle will likely repeat. If your family owns a business, a fire can mean utter ruin. Your shop, your tools, your inventory, your account books, all gone. You might have to start again from nothing, perhaps borrowing money at exorbitant rates, or seeking charity from your guild or relatives. The path to recovery is long and arduous, shadowed by the memory of loss. The government might try to regulate the storage of flammable materials, the construction of fire-resistant storehouses, kura for valuables, and the width of streets. But the sheer scale of the city, and the vested interests of landowners and merchants, often make comprehensive reform difficult. Edo remains a city perpetually on the brink. The sounds of an earthquake are deeply unsettling. First perhaps, a low rumble, a subterranean groan. Then the shaking begins, a gentle tremor escalating into a violent convulsion, the creaking and groaning of your wooden house, the clatter of household items falling, the panicked cries of your family and neighbors. It is a primal terror, the very earth beneath you turning traitor. In the aftermath of an earthquake, you pick your way through streets littered with debris, past collapsed or dangerously tilted houses. You search for loved ones, for salvageable possessions. The familiar landscape of your neighborhood is transformed into a chaotic ruin. The air is filled with dust and the cries of the injured or bereaved. It is a scene of profound disorientation and shock. The fear of aftershocks can last for days, even weeks. After a major earthquake, every small tremor, every unexplained noise, sends a fresh jolt of panic through you. You sleep fitfully, if at all, ready to flee at a moment's notice. The sense of safety, of solid ground beneath your feet, is shattered. The city's water supply, often drawn from wooden aqueducts or wells, can be disrupted by earthquakes or contaminated by debris and bodies after a fire. Access to clean drinking water becomes a critical problem, exacerbating the risk of disease in the already devastated areas. This adds another layer of hardship to the struggle for survival. Religious institutions play a complex role. Temples and shrines might offer sanctuary, or become centers for distributing aid. Priests and monks conduct rituals to appease angered deities, or to pray for the souls of the departed. But the sheer scale of the suffering can also lead to questioning, to a crisis of faith, when prayers seem to go unanswered. The social bonds within your local neighborhood, machi, are crucial for survival. Neighbors help each other, share information and organize local firefighting efforts or rescue parties. This communal solidarity is a vital resource in a city where official aid is often slow to arrive or inadequate. Your immediate community is your first line of defense and support. The government's response to disasters is often focused on maintaining public order and quickly clearing major thoroughfares, rather than on providing comprehensive relief to individual victims. You are largely expected to fend for yourself and your family, relying on your own resources, your guild, or your neighborhood. Self-reliance, born of necessity, is a key characteristic of Edo life. The impermanence of your physical surroundings fosters a certain philosophical outlook, perhaps an appreciation for the transient beauty of the floating world, for the fleeting pleasures of life. If everything can be lost in an instant, then perhaps one should savor the present moment. This might be one way of coping with the constant uncertainty. The frequent fires lead to the development of a unique urban aesthetic. Open spaces, fire breaks, and easily dismantled structures are common. There is a constant cycle of destruction and renewal that shapes the very appearance and character of Edo. The city is not a static monument, but a dynamic, ever-changing organism, constantly rebuilding itself from its own ashes. Consider the plight of those who are ill, elderly or disabled when disaster strikes. Their chances of escape are significantly reduced. They are often the forgotten victims, reliant on the bravery and compassion of family members or neighbors, or simply left to their fate in the ensuing chaos. Their vulnerability is a stark reminder of the harsh realities of this world. The air quality in Edo, even without a major fire, is often poor, filled with wood smoke from countless hearths. During and after a conflagration, it becomes almost unbreathable, a thick, acrid pall hanging over the city for days, irritating eyes and lungs, and spreading a film of soot over everything. This is another constant sensory assault. The city's bridges, vital for escape across its many canals and rivers during a fire, can become deadly bottlenecks, choked with panicking crowds. Collapses or fires on the bridges themselves can trap thousands, leading to horrific loss of life. Escape routes are often as dangerous as the disaster itself. The economic stratification of Edo means that the wealthy, samurai, rich merchants, often live in more spacious, somewhat more fire-resistant dwellings, or have the means to flee the city more easily. The commoners, packed into dense, flammable tenements, bear the brunt of these disasters. Your social status directly impacts your chances of survival. The tales of heroism and self-sacrifice during fires and earthquakes become part of the city's folklore. Stories of brave firefighters, of neighbors rescuing neighbors, of families enduring unimaginable loss, with courage and resilience. These stories provide a counter-narrative to the despair, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The constant rebuilding creates a demand for lumber, for carpenters, for laborers, while individual fortunes are wiped out. The cycle of destruction also fuels a certain kind of economic activity. It is a grim sort of urban metabolism, where the city consumes itself, and is reborn, again and again. This offers little comfort if you are the one whose home has just been incinerated. The fear of a fire-starting wind, a strong dry wind that can quickly spread flames across vast distances, is a particular dread. On such days the entire city is on edge, every citizen a reluctant fire warden, watching for the first telltale sign of smoke. The weather itself becomes an antagonist, a potential bringer of doom. The government maintains storehouses of rice and other supplies, intended for relief in times of disaster, but bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption or simply the overwhelming scale of the need, can mean that this aid is slow to arrive, insufficient or unfairly distributed. You cannot rely on official charity. Your survival often depends on your own wits, and the support of your immediate community. The traditional Japanese reverence for nature sits uneasily with the destructive power of earthquakes and tsunamis. These events are reminders of the awesome, untamable forces that govern human existence, humbling even the most powerful shogunate. Your life is lived in a delicate, often terrifying balance with these elemental powers. The psychological adaptation to this constant threat involves a degree of stoicism, a pragmatic acceptance of risk. You learn to live with uncertainty, to rebuild quickly, to not become too attached to material possessions that can vanish in smoke or be swallowed by the earth. This resilience is born of necessity, a survival trait honed over generations of recurrent disaster. The aftermath of a major fire or earthquake is a landscape of blackened ruins, of tilted, shattered homes, of streets choked with debris. It is a scene of almost unimaginable desolation. Yet, amidst this you will also see the first signs of recovery, a makeshift stall, selling food, a family beginning to clear the rubble of their home, a child playing with a salvaged toy,
life in its tenacious way, reasserts itself. The flowers of Edo may be a euphemism for destruction, but they also paradoxically speak to the city's vibrant, irrepressible energy, its capacity for constant renewal. Your life within its wooden walls is a testament to human endurance, a daily dance with danger, a precarious existence, lived always on the edge, under the shadow of flame and the trembling of the earth.
It began not as a treasure but as a piece of political administration, a stone notice intended for a world of priests and bureaucrats. The year was 1906 before the Christian era, and the land of Egypt was ruled by a dynasty of foreigners. The Ptolemies were Greek, descendants of the great Alexander's general, and their grip on the ancient kingdom was tenuous. The throne was held by a boy king, Ptolemy V, and his reign was troubled by rebellion and intrigue. In the ancient city of Memphis, a synod of Egyptian priests convened, seeking to bolster the young king's authority and affirm their own privileged position. They issued a decree, a long and rather conventional text praising the king for his piety and his generosity to the temples. It detailed his victories over enemies, his remission of taxes, and his support for the sacred animal cults. To ensure their proclamation was understood by all the key strata of society, they ordered it to be inscribed on a stela of hard, dark stone, in 3 distinct scripts. The first was the script of the gods, the sacred hieroglyphs, the beautiful and complex pictures that adorned the walls of temples. The second was the script of the people, Demotic, the cursive shorthand used for everyday documents. The third was the script of the rulers, ancient Greek, the language of the Ptolemaic court and its administration. Copies of this stela were to be erected in every major temple in Egypt. It was a piece of public relations, destined, its creators assumed, for a quiet eternity of local reverence. They could never have imagined that one of these stones would one day become the key to their entire civilization. For centuries, the stone stood. The Ptolemaic dynasty rose to its zenith with its last queen, Cleopatra, and then fell to the rising power of Rome. As Christianity spread across the empire, the old gods of Egypt were abandoned, their temples closed, their rituals forbidden. With the closing of the temples, the ancient knowledge of the sacred scripts was lost. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in the year after that. Silence. The beautiful pictures that covered the monuments of the Nile Valley became a profound and impenetrable mystery. Scholars in the Islamic world and later in Renaissance Europe gazed upon them with awe and fascination. They believed them to be purely symbolic, a form of mystical allegory, not a functioning language. Each sign, they thought, held a complex philosophical idea. To read them was not to translate, but to meditate upon divine secrets. The notion that these birds, lions and serpents could represent simple sounds was lost to time. As for the stone decree from Memphis, its purpose forgotten, it was eventually toppled, broken, and recycled, used as common building material in the construction of a military fort in the Nile Delta. Buried under sand and mud, its long sleep ended in the summer of 1799, a time of cannon fire and conquest. A French army, led by a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, was in. Napoleon's invasion was not merely a military endeavor. It was a product of the Enlightenment, a scientific expedition as much as a colonial one. He brought with him a corps of over 60 savants, scholars, engineers, artists, and scientists, tasked with studying and documenting every aspect of this ancient land. In mid-July, near the port town of Rashid, which the Europeans called Rosetta, a detachment of French soldiers under the command of an engineering officer named Pierre-François Bouchard was working to strengthen the defenses of an old Mamluk fort. As his men demolished a wall, they uncovered a slab of dark granodiorite about 4 feet high, its face covered with engraved text. Bouchard, a man of education, saw immediately that this was no ordinary stone. It held 3 distinct bands of writing. The bottom section was instantly recognizable as ancient Greek. The top was clearly the enigmatic hieroglyphs of the pharaohs, and the script in the middle, though unfamiliar, was different from the other two. Bouchard realized with a jolt of insight that if these 3 scripts recorded the same text, then this stone was a potential key, a parallel text that could unlock the mystery of ancient Egypt. The stone was sent to the savants in Cairo, where it caused an immediate sensation. They named it the Rosetta Stone. Lithographers were put to work making precise copies of the inscriptions, which were then dispatched to scholars and institutions across Europe. The intellectual race had begun, but the stone itself was soon to embark on another journey. In 1801, the French army in Egypt was defeated by a combined British and Ottoman force. After a tense standoff, the French were forced to surrender their collection of antiquities, including the Rosetta Stone. Despite the passionate objections of the French scholars, the stone was loaded onto a British frigate, The following year it arrived in England and was presented to King George III, who in turn deposited it in the British Museum, where it has remained ever since. The physical prize was in London, but the intellectual battle to crack its code would be fought on both sides of the Channel, fueled by a fierce national rivalry. The challenge was immense. The Greek text was quickly translated, confirming it was a decree in honor of Ptolemy V. The fundamental assumption was that the other two scripts told the same story, but the Demotic script was a confusing scrawl of interconnected lines, and the hieroglyphic section was the most damaged, with large portions missing. The first great mind to make significant progress was an Englishman, Dr. Thomas Young. Young was a true polymath, a prodigy who had reportedly read the entire Bible twice by the age of 4. He was a physician by trade, but his genius knew no bounds. He made groundbreaking discoveries in the physics of light, in optics, and in medicine. He approached the Rosetta Stone not as a linguist, but as a codebreaker, a scientist looking for patterns. He focused on the Demotic text first, painstakingly comparing it to the Greek and managing to isolate and identify many groups of signs corresponding to words like king, temple, and Egypt. He then turned his attention to the hieroglyphs. He was the one who made the crucial observation that certain groups of hieroglyphs were enclosed in an oval ring, a shape he called a cartoon, reasoning that these must highlight a name of great importance, and knowing from the Greek text that the king's name was Ptolemy, he correctly deduced that the cartouches contained the name of the ruler. Working with the cartouche of Ptolemy, Young methodically assigned sound values to the individual hieroglyphs within it. He correctly identified the signs for P, T, O, L and M. He had proven that the sacred script was not purely symbolic, it had a phonetic component, but Young's own brilliance became his barrier. He remained convinced that this phonetic aspect was a late, corrupt development, used only to spell out the names of foreign rulers like the Greek Ptolemy. He could not bring himself to believe that this was the native system for the language of the ancient pharaohs. He had found the key, but he was unable to fully turn it in the lock. He published his preliminary findings and moved on to other intellectual pursuits. Across the Channel in France, a very different kind of genius was at work. Jean-François Champollion was not a polymath. He was a monomaniac. From his earliest childhood, he was consumed by a single all-encompassing passion, ancient Egypt. As a boy, upon first seeing a copy of the Rosetta Stone's inscriptions, he had vowed that he would be the one to read them. He was a linguistic prodigy of breathtaking talent, mastering Latin, Greek, Hebrew and Arabic before he was a teenager. Crucially, he dedicated himself to the study of Coptic, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians. He was convinced that Coptic, which was written in the Greek alphabet but was linguistically descended from the ancient Egyptian language, held the echoes of the tongue spoken by the pharaoh. He immersed himself in it, learning to think and write in it, believing it was the living soul of the dead script. For years Champollion toiled in poverty and obscurity, driven by his obsession and a burning patriotic desire to claim the prize of decipherment for France. He knew of Young's work, but was initially resistant to the phonetic theory, clinging to the idea of the hieroglyphs as symbols. He spent years going down blind alleys, trying to create a dictionary of symbols, an effort that ultimately failed. Slowly, painstakingly, he came to accept Young's initial breakthrough about the cartouches and the phonetic signs for Ptolemy, but he needed more data. The name Ptolemy alone was not enough. The crucial piece of evidence came not from the Rosetta Stone itself, but from a copy of an inscription on an obelisk that had been brought to England. This obelisk contained a cartouche of Ptolemy, but also a second, different cartouche, identified in its Greek inscription as belonging to a queen, Cleopatra. This was the moment Champollion had been waiting for. He now had two different names, with some shared letters, written in hieroglyph. He wrote them out, one above the other, Ptolemy's and Cleopatra. The letter P was the first sign in Ptolemy and the fifth in Cleopatra. In both cartouches, the sign was the same, a small square. The letter O, the fourth sign in Ptolemy and the second in Cleopatra, was also the same, a coiled rope. The L, the third sign in Ptolemy and the fourth in Cleopatra, was a line in both. It was perfect. The system worked. He now had a small but confirmed alphabet of phonetic signs, but the final definitive test remained. Was this system only used for the names of Greek rulers, or was it the authentic, native system of the ancient Egyptians themselves? Champollion obtained copies of cartouches from temples far older than the Ptolemaic era. He set aside the names of the Greek rulers, and looked at a cartouche containing a sign of the sun, followed by two other signs he was unfamiliar with. The Coptic word for sun was Ra. He tentatively assigned that sound to the first sign. He then looked at the final sign, which he recognized from his Ptolemy Cleopatra alphabet as S. In the middle was an unknown sign.
He thought of famous pharaonic names. Could it be Rameses? Rameses. It fit perfectly. He turned to another cartoon. It began with an ibis, the sacred bird of the god Thoth. He tried the sound Thoth. The next sign was the unknown middle sign from Rameses. Mes, Thoth, Mes, Thoth, Mes. Another great pharaoh. It was the electrifying moment of discovery. The code was broken. The hieroglyphs were a complex, beautiful and functioning system. A hybrid of phonetic signs, representing sounds, and determinatives and ideograms, representing whole ideas. It was not a primitive or foreign corruption. It was the vibrant, living heart of the ancient Egyptian world. The story goes that on September 14, 1822, upon making this final connection, Champollion leaped from his chair and ran through the streets of Paris to his brother's office at the Institut de France. He burst in, threw his papers on the desk, and cried, "Je tiens mon affaire, I've got it," and promptly collapsed, falling into a dead faint that lasted for 5 days. His health was broken by years of relentless work. But his mind had triumphed. He had unlocked the silence of millennia. When he presented his findings, a new field of study was born: Egyptology. For the first time, scholars could read the stories the ancient Egyptians had written themselves. The inscriptions on temple walls were not just decoration, but histories of battles and hymns to the god. The texts on papyrus scrolls were poems, letters, legal contracts, and medical treatises. A civilization that had been known only through the biased accounts of Greek and biblical writers could now speak in its own voice. The Rosetta Stone sits today in the British Museum, its glass case, surrounded by visitors from around the world. It is not the most beautiful artifact in the collection. It is a broken, functional object, but its value is incalculable. It is a monument not to a king, but to the power of language itself. It is a symbol of human curiosity, of the relentless drive to understand, and of the intellectual passion that can resurrect a lost world, allowing the dead to speak to the living across the silent chasm of time.
The world of Salem Village in the winter of 1692 was small, cold, and shadowed by fear. It was a community clinging to the edge of a vast, unknown wilderness, a place where the forest felt as vast and menacing as the ocean. Its people were Puritans, a people of the book, who saw the world as a battleground between God and Satan, and who believed the devil was not a distant theological concept, but an immediate, active presence in their daily lives. Their existence was hard, a constant struggle against rocky soil, harsh weather, and the ever-present threat of disease and conflict on the frontier. This small farming outpost was also a community at war with itself. It was a place of simmering resentments, of bitter disputes over land boundaries and grazing rights. The villagers chafed under the authority of the more prosperous and worldly port of Salem town, a few miles away, from which they were trying to gain their independence. At the center of many of these disputes was the village meeting house and its contentious minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris was a rigid and grasping man, formerly a merchant in the Caribbean, who felt his authority was not given the respect it was due. The village was divided between those who supported him and those who sought to drive him out. The air was thick with mistrust. In the heart of this fractured community, within the cold walls of the minister's own house, the spark was struck. In February, a strange malady fell upon 2 young girls in the Parris household. His 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth, known as Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. The girls began to exhibit terrifying symptoms. They would lapse into trance-like states, then suddenly cry out, their bodies contorting into impossible shapes. They would crawl under furniture, make animal noises, and complain of being pinched, bitten, and pricked by invisible needles. Reverend Parris prayed over them, but their condition only worsened. Soon the affliction began to spread, like a contagion of fear, to other young women in the village. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of the village's most influential families, began to have fits. So did Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant in the Putnam household. The village was gripped by a terrifying question: what was the source of this strange torment? The local doctor, William Griggs, was summoned. He examined the girls, but could find no sign of any known physical ailment. He delivered a diagnosis that was both medical and theological, a conclusion that gave a name to their deepest fears. The girls, he declared, were under the evil hand. They were bewitched. Once the word witchcraft was spoken aloud, the situation transformed. The mystery was no longer medical, it was criminal and spiritual. The question was no longer what was wrong with the girls, but who was doing this to them. The local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, were called in to investigate. They began to pressure the afflicted girls, demanding that they name their tormentors. In the charged atmosphere of the parsonage, with prayers and questions swirling around them,
the girls finally began to point fingers. Their first 3 accusations fell upon women, who were easy targets, individuals on the lowest rungs of the village's social ladder. The first was Sarah Good, a destitute, pipe-smoking woman, who wandered the village begging for food and muttering curses when she was turned away. The second was Sarah Osborne, an elderly and bedridden woman, who had angered the powerful Putnam family over an inheritance dispute, and had not attended church in over a year. The third and most central figure was Tituba, the Paris family's slave. Tituba had been brought by Paris from Barbados. Her foreignness, her different culture and skin color, made her an object of both fascination and suspicion in the homogeneous Puritan community. She was the perfect outsider on whom to project their fear. On the 1st of March 1692, the 3 accused women were brought to the village meeting house for a public examination. The meeting house was packed. The entire community assembled to witness the confrontation. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne vehemently denied the charge, but when they spoke, the afflicted girls in the audience would writhe and scream, claiming the specters of the 2 women were tormenting them right there in the room. The magistrates, particularly the aggressive and dogmatic Hathorne, accepted the girls' behavior as proof of guilt, but the examination of Tituba was what blew the smoldering embers of suspicion into a full-blown fire. Initially, Tituba also denied being a witch, but after being interrogated for days, likely facing threats and pressure from her master, Reverend Paris, she changed her story. But it was not a simple confession. It was a vivid, detailed, and terrifying narrative, a tapestry woven from Puritan folklore, Caribbean traditions, and a desperate imagination. She told the magistrates of flying through the air on a pole, of a tall man from Boston, dressed in black, of a red rat and a black dog. She described a book presented to her by the devil, and she said she had signed it in her own blood. And then she delivered the most fatal words of all. She claimed she was not alone. There were other witches in Salem village, she said, 9 of them in total, who had joined her in the devil's service. Tituba's confession was a catalyst. It confirmed the community's worst fears, and seemed to validate the girls' affliction. It transformed the situation from a case against 3 outcast women, into an unfolding conspiracy of evil, a hidden network of Satan's agents, living in their very midst. The hunt was on. The afflicted girls, now at the center of attention, and wielding an intoxicating new power, began to name more names. The accusations moved beyond the usual suspects. Martha Corey, a respectable church-going woman, who had openly expressed skepticism about the girls' claims, was accused. Then Rebecca Nurse, a pious, 71-year-old matriarch known throughout the region for her goodness, was named. The community was stunned. When her name was first mentioned, John Hathorne himself exclaimed that it was not possible, but the girls insisted, their fits growing more violent. The specter of Rebecca Nurse, they shrieked, was trying to force them to sign the devil's book. As the jails in Salem began to fill, the colony's governor, Sir William Phipps, established a special court of oyer and terminer, a court to hear and determine to handle the witchcraft cases. The court was presided over by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a man with no legal training but a profound conviction that Massachusetts was under demonic assault, and that swift, harsh justice was required. It was this court that would make a fateful legal decision, one that sealed the doom of the accused. It decided to admit what was known as spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was the testimony of the afflicted, that they were being tormented by the spirit, or specter of the accused person. In the minds of the Salem magistrates, the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person to torment another. Therefore, if Abigail Williams claimed that the specter of Rebecca Nurse was pinching her, it was taken as proof that Rebecca Nurse had made a covenant with the devil to allow him to use her shape. For the accused, this was an impossible charge to refute. How could one prove what their spirit was, or was not doing in a realm no one else could see? They were trapped in a legal nightmare, where the accusations of their tormentors were the primary evidence against them. The trials themselves were a form of public theater. The courtroom was charged with a palpable, hysterical energy. When an accused person was brought in, the afflicted girls, who sat in a group at the front, would collapse into convulsions. They would contort and scream, claiming the witch was attacking them with her eye. They would mimic the movements of the accused, as if they were puppets on a string. If the accused bit her lip, the girls would cry that they were being bitten. If she leaned to one side, they would all lean with her. It was a terrifyingly effective performance, and it left the judges and the public with little doubt as to the guilt of the person on trial. The first person to be brought to trial and hanged was Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper with a reputation for worldliness and an independent spirit. She was an easy target, but the conviction and execution of Rebecca Nurse on July 19, sent a shockwave through the colony. Despite a petition signed by dozens of her neighbors attesting to her good character, and despite the jury initially finding her not guilty, the judges and the afflicted girls pressured the jury into reconsidering. She was condemned and hanged, her body cast into a shallow, unmarked grave on Gallows Hill. The accused were faced with a terrible paradox. If they maintained their innocence, they were found guilty and executed. If they confessed to being a witch, a lie, their lives would be spared. The court believed that a confession was the first step toward repentance, and that a confessed witch could provide valuable information about the devil's conspiracy. This created a perverse incentive to lie. Dozens of people confessed, realizing it was their only hope of survival. But in confessing, they were forced to name others, to implicate their own friends and neighbors, perpetuating the cycle of accusation and death. Some, however, refused to lie, even to save their own lives. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer and tavern keeper, had been an early and vocal critic of the proceedings, calling the afflicted girls liars. Soon enough, he and his pregnant wife Elizabeth were accused. In prison, he wrote a letter pleading with ministers in Boston to intervene, describing the torture used to extract confessions, and the impossibility of a fair trial in Salem. His pleas were ignored. At his execution, he stood on the gallows, reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something a witch was supposedly unable to do before he was hanged. Perhaps the most brutal episode was the fate of Giles Corey, Martha Corey's 81-year-old husband. A stubborn and contentious man, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty at his trial. By refusing to plead, he could not be legally tried, and therefore his property could not be confiscated by the state, ensuring his sons would inherit his farm. The penalty for refusing to plead was an ancient and barbaric one: pressing. He was taken to a field, staked to the ground, and a heavy wooden board was placed on his chest. Large stones were piled on top, one by one, to force a plea from him. For 2 days he endured the agony in silence. His only words when the sheriff asked him to plead were a defiant request: more weight. He was pressed to death, a martyr not for faith, but for a principle. By the autumn of 1692, the hysteria had reached its peak. Nearly 200 people were in jail. The accusations had become increasingly outlandish, targeting wealthy merchants, ministers, and even the wife of Governor Phipps himself. The very absurdity of the widening circle of accusations began to sow the seeds of doubt. The educated elite in Boston, led by ministers like Increase Mather, began to publicly challenge the proceedings. Mather published a powerful treatise, arguing that the court's reliance on spectral evidence was a grave error. He declared that it was better that 10 suspected witches escape than that one innocent person be condemned. The public mood, once fervent and fearful, began to shift towards skepticism and exhaustion. The autumn harvest was being neglected, as so many people were either in jail or caught up in the trials. The economic and social cost was becoming unbearable. Finally, in October, Governor Phipps, prompted by the public backlash and the criticism from Boston, ordered a halt to the proceedings of the Court of Oyer and Terminer. He established a new superior court, which disallowed the use of spectral evidence. Without it, the cases against the remaining accused fell apart. Most were acquitted. In May of 1693, Phipps issued a general pardon, freeing all those still in prison on witchcraft charges. The nightmare was over. In the end, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. At least 5 more, including Sarah Osborne, had died in the squalid conditions of the jails. One man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death. The aftermath was a long and painful period of reflection and regret. The colony of Massachusetts held a day of public fasting and repentance. Samuel Sowell, one of the judges, stood up in his church in Boston and publicly confessed his blame and shame for his role in the trials, asking for forgiveness from God and the community. 12 of the jurors signed a letter of apology. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prolific of the young accusers, made a public confession in 1706, asking forgiveness from the families of the victims, claiming she had been deluded by Satan. The Salem witch trials remain one of the most haunting episodes in American history. They stand as a chilling cautionary tale about the deadly convergence of religious extremism, social anxiety, and mass hysteria. It is a story of how a small, isolated community, crippled by its own internal divisions, and steeped in a profound fear of the unknown, allowed its system of justice to be hijacked by the spectral fantasies of children and the dogmatic certainty of its leader. The echoes of Salem still linger, a permanent reminder of the fragility of reason and the terrible consequences of a society that, in its zeal to hunt monsters, ends up creating them.
In the autumn of 1609, in the vibrant university city of Padua, a professor of mathematics named Galileo Galilei, a man of immense intellect and equally immense ambition, heard a rumor. Word had arrived from the Netherlands of a curious invention, a spyglass that could make distant objects appear closer, while others saw a novelty, a toy for merchants or a tool for generals. Galileo saw the heavens. He was not the inventor of the telescope, but he would be the first to comprehend its true power. Without having seen a single example, working only from the barest description of the device, he set about building his own. His first attempts magnified by a factor of 3. Within months he had crafted an instrument that could magnify by 20, and he turned it to the night sky. What he saw in the following months would shatter a conception of the cosmos that had held humanity in its thrall for 2,000 years. The ancient model, codified by Aristotle and the astronomer Ptolemy, was one of perfection and order. The earth sat unmoving at the center of the universe, and around it revolved the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets and the stars, all of which were perfect, unblemished spheres, gliding in perfect circles, composed of a divine, ethereal substance. Galileo's telescope demolished this perfect world, one observation at a time. He looked at the moon and saw not a smooth, polished orb, but a world like our own, scarred with craters and ribbed with mountains, whose long sharp shadows he could see stretching across the lunar plane. He had proven that the celestial bodies were not perfect. He turned his telescope to the Milky Way, and saw that it was not a hazy cloud, but was composed of countless individual stars, a multitude so vast it suggested a universe far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. His most stunning discoveries came when he observed the planets. He looked at Jupiter and saw 4 small points of light orbiting it. Night after night, he had discovered moons that did not orbit the Earth. This was a profound blow to the geocentric model. Here was clear proof that smaller bodies could and did orbit a larger one, other than the Earth. He then observed Venus, and found that it exhibited a full set of phases, just like our own moon, from a thin crescent to a full disk. This was something that was impossible in the Ptolemaic system, but it was a natural and necessary consequence of the sun-centered model proposed by the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus, nearly 70 years earlier. Galileo knew he was sitting on a revolution. In March of 1610, he published his findings in a slim, sensational book titled Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger. The book caused a shockwave across Europe. It made Galileo the most famous scientist in the world, a man who had seen new worlds with his own eye. He leveraged this fame to secure a prestigious new position, leaving the grind of university teaching behind to become the chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo II de' Medici, in Florence. This move gave him wealth and status, but it also placed him squarely in the public eye, transforming his scientific discoveries into matters of courtly and inevitably ecclesiastical politics. Initially, the church was not his adversary. When Galileo visited Rome in 1611, he was celebrated. He was made a member of a prestigious scientific society. The powerful Jesuit astronomers at the Roman College, the intellectual heart of the Jesuit order, looked through his telescope and publicly confirmed his discovery. The opposition came not from the theologians, but from the entrenched academics in the universities. These were men whose entire careers and intellectual authority were based on the philosophy of Aristotle. Galileo's findings threatened to make their entire library of knowledge obsolete, and they fought back, not with telescopes, but with appeals to tradition and authority. The conflict began to shift from the academic to the theological. When these opponents realized they could not win on scientific grounds, they began to argue that Galileo's support for the Copernican sun-centered model was not just philosophically unsound, but was a threat to the Holy Scripture. They pointed to passages like the one in the book of Joshua, where Joshua commands the sun, not the earth, to stand still. If the Bible said the sun moved, then the earth must be stationary. To suggest otherwise was to challenge the inerrant word of God. Galileo, a devout Catholic, understood the danger. He did not believe his science contradicted his faith. He waded into the theological debate himself, writing a long and brilliant essay, The Letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, in which he argued for a separation of spheres. The Bible, he wrote, teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. It was written in the language of common people, not in the precise language of mathematics, and its purpose was salvation, not astronomy. To interpret it as a literal science textbook was a mistake that would only bring ridicule upon the church. He argued that where science provided physical proof, theology must reinterpret scripture. But he was a layman entering a domain jealously guarded by the clergy. His arguments, however eloquent, were seen as an intrusion. The matter was formally taken up by the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Rome. The chief consulting theologian was Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, an intelligent and powerful man, who saw the danger in allowing a scientific theory to challenge the traditional interpretation of Scripture. In February 1616,
A commission of consultants to the Holy Office declared the Copernican proposition, that the sun is the center of the universe, and the earth moves, to be foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. Galileo himself was not condemned as a heretic, but he was summoned by Cardinal Bellarmine, and given a formal warning. He was instructed that he must not hold, teach, or defend the Copernican doctrine in any way, orally or in writing. Galileo, faced with the full authority of the Inquisition, acquiesced. He promised to obey and was allowed to return to Florence. An uneasy silence settled over the issue for several years. In 1623, Galileo's fortunes seemed to change. His friend and admirer Cardinal Maffeo Barberini was elected to the papal throne, taking the name Pope Urban. Urban was a man of great vanity, a poet, and a patron of the arts, who considered himself a sophisticated intellectual. He held Galileo in high esteem. In a series of audiences, the Pope indicated to Galileo that he might have more freedom to discuss astronomical theory. He told Galileo he could write about the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems, as long as he treated the Copernican view as a mere mathematical hypothesis, not as a physical reality, and that he concluded by stating that God's omnipotence meant the universe could be arranged in any way he chose, and its true nature was ultimately unknowable by man. Galileo saw this as a green light. He spent the next 6 years working on his masterpiece, the book he believed would be his lasting legacy. Published in 1632, it was called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. To navigate the Church's restrictions, he wrote it not as a treatise, but as a conversation between 3 friends. The first, Salviati, is a brilliant and eloquent scholar, who argues for the Copernican system. The second, Sagredo, is an intelligent, open-minded nobleman, representing the curious layman. The third character, who argues for the traditional earth-centered view of Aristotle and Ptolemy, he named Simplicio. The choice of the name was a catastrophic miscalculation. While there was a historical precedent for the name among ancient philosophers, its Italian meaning was unmistakable: simpleton, or fool. Throughout the dialogue, Salviati brilliantly and systematically demolishes every one of Simplicio's arguments, making him appear stubborn, foolish, and reliant on outdated dogma. The book was a literary and scientific masterpiece, a devastatingly effective argument for the Copernican worldview. But Galileo had committed a fatal act of hubris. For the final argument in the book, the one the Pope himself had given him, about God's omnipotence making the true state of the world unknowable, Galileo placed it in the mouth of the fool, Simplicio. When the book was published and reached Rome, Pope Urban VIII was enraged. He believed Galileo had deliberately deceived him, and had held him, the vicar of Christ, up to public ridicule. His vanity wounded, and his authority challenged, the Pope's friendship turned to fury. He felt he had been made to look like a simpleton. He unleashed the full power of the Inquisition against the man he had once protected. Galileo, now nearly 70 years old, frail and suffering from illness, was summoned to Rome to stand trial for heresy. His journey in the winter was arduous, and he arrived in Rome a frightened old man, a prisoner of the institution he had sought to enlighten. The trial that followed was not really a scientific debate. It was a legal proceeding about disobedience. The inquisitors were not interested in the phases of Venus, or the moons of Jupiter. They were interested in whether Galileo had violated the injunction of. To make their case, the prosecution produced a controversial document, from the files of that earlier meeting, a supposed summary of the proceeding. This document claimed that Galileo had been given a much stricter, personal injunction, forbidding him from even discussing Copernicanism in any way whatsoever. This was a far cry from Bellarmine's original warning, not to hold or defend it. The authenticity of this document is still debated by historians, but at the trial it was used as damning evidence. Galileo, faced with this questionable evidence, and the implicit threat of torture, saw his defense crumble. He knew he was beaten. The climax came on the morning of June. In a large hall in the convent of Santa Maria Sopra, Minerva, Galileo was led before the cardinals of the Inquisition. He was dressed in the white shirt of a penitent. His sentence was read aloud. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy. His dialogue was to be banned, and he was sentenced to formal imprisonment for the rest of his life. And as the final condition of his sentence, he was to publicly abjure his errors. The old man, the greatest scientist of his age, was forced to kneel. With a quavering voice, he read from a prepared text, a statement of utter humiliation. He swore on the Holy Gospels that he had always believed, and with God's help would in the future believe, all that the Holy Catholic Church held, preached, and taught. He declared, "I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies, and I swear that in the future I will never again say or assert, verbally, or in writing anything that might cause a similar suspicion against me." He had been forced to deny the truth that he had seen with his own eyes. A legend, almost certainly untrue but emotionally resonant,
arose that after he stood up, he stamped his foot on the ground, and muttered to himself, "Et pour si muove." And yet the legend persists because it captures the spirit of a truth that could be silenced, but not changed. His prison sentence was immediately commuted to house arrest. He was to spend the rest of his life as a prisoner in his own villa, in Arcetri, overlooking Florence. He was forbidden from having many visitors, and his movements were monitored. For a time he was broken by the ordeal, but the fire of his intellect was not entirely extinguished. In the quiet of his confinement, even as his eyesight began to fail, an ironic final cruelty for the man who had seen farther than anyone before him, he returned to the work he had begun decades earlier, on the science of motion. He wrote his final and perhaps greatest book, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations, concerning two new sciences. It was a foundational text of modern physics, exploring the principles of mechanics, the strength of materials, and the motion of falling objects. As he was forbidden from publishing, the manuscript was smuggled out of Italy and published in the Netherlands, a final act of defiance. Galileo Galilei died in his villa in 16. It was the same year that Isaac Newton was born in England, the man who would take Galileo's work on motion, and build upon it a new system of the universe. Galileo's story became a legend, a cautionary tale of the conflict between reason and dogma, a symbol of the individual conscience, standing against institutional power. He was not in the end, a simple martyr for science. He was a proud, flawed and brilliant man, who through a combination of genius, ambition and arrogance, forced a confrontation that neither he nor the Church could win. More than 350 years would pass before the Catholic Church would formally admit that it had erred in its condemnation of him, a final quiet acknowledgement, that though men can be silenced, the earth, indeed, continues to move.
Before the Great Rot came, Ireland was a land of breathtaking beauty and profound contradiction. It was an island of rolling green hills, misty bogs and a coastline fractured into 1,000 dramatic cliffs and coves. It was also a land of deep, systemic poverty, a place where the social structure itself was a carefully constructed engine of destitution for the majority of its people. For centuries the island had been under British rule. Its laws and its land were controlled by a Protestant ascendancy, an elite class of landlords, many of whom lived absentee lives in England, viewing their Irish estates as little more than a source of revenue. Beneath this ruling class existed the vast population of native Irish Catholics, a people dispossessed in their own homeland. They lived as tenant farmers, working small plots of land rented from the great estates. Over the generations, as the population grew, these plots were subdivided again and again, shrinking until they were barely large enough to support a single family. In this precarious world, survival depended on a single agricultural miracle, the potato. The potato was not a choice, it was a necessity. It was a wonder crop, capable of producing a greater yield of food per acre than any other. On just a single acre of poor, rocky soil, a family could grow enough potatoes to feed themselves for most of the year. It allowed the population to swell, reaching over 8 million by the early 1840s. But this reliance created a terrifying vulnerability. The entire nutritional foundation of a nation rested on the health of one single plant. The Irish peasant, with his small plot of land and his spade, was living on a knife's edge, a single crop failure away from utter ruin. This was the Ireland that awaited the arrival of the Blight. In the late summer of 1845, a strange and ominous phenomenon was observed. A thick, eerie fog rolled in from the south, blanketing the fields. It carried with it a sickeningly sweet, unfamiliar smell. When the fog lifted, farmers walking their fields noticed the leaves of their potato plants were curling and turning black, as if they had been scorched by fire. With a growing sense of dread, they dug into the earth to check the tubers. Some seemed healthy, but when brought inside, they would turn into a foul-smelling, black, slimy mush within days. Others were already rotten in the ground. A mysterious disease had struck the heart of Ireland's food supply. The cause was a microscopic water mold, Phyta infestans, its spores having traveled across the Atlantic from North America. It was an organism previously unknown in Europe, and it found the vast, genetically uniform potato fields of Ireland to be the perfect breeding ground. The blight was devastatingly efficient. An entire field could look healthy one day and be a blackened, rotting ruin the next. The potato crop of 1845 was only a partial failure. Perhaps 40% of the harvest was lost. There was hardship and honor, but not yet a full-scale catastrophe. The people and the government in London hoped it was a freak occurrence, a one-time event. They stored what healthy potatoes they could find for the next year's planting, praying that the blight would not return.
It was a prayer that would not be answered. The British government, under the Conservative Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, responded to this first year with a degree of caution and pragmatism. Though a firm believer in the principles of free markets, Peel understood the potential for disaster. Secretly, so as not to disrupt private trade, he authorized the purchase of £100,000 worth of maize, or Indian corn, from the United States. It was to be held in reserve and sold cheaply to the Irish to keep food prices down, but the measure was fraught with problems. The Irish had little experience with corn. They called it Peel's brimstone. There were not enough mills to grind it properly, and it was difficult to cook, often causing severe digestive problems. It was a well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate gesture. In the summer of 1846, all hope vanished. The weather was warm and humid, perfect conditions for the blight. It returned with a vengeance, and this time, it was total. From one end of the island to the other, the potato crop was completely annihilated. The fields that should have fed millions produced nothing but black, stinking decay. The foundation of Irish life had crumbled into dust. As the country stared into the abyss, the government in London changed. Peel's Conservatives fell from power and were replaced by the Whig Party, led by Lord John Russell. The Russell government was controlled by men who were devout, almost fanatical, believers in a rigid economic ideology, lazy. They held that it was not the business of government to interfere with the natural workings of the economy. Providing free or subsidized food, they argued, would distort the market, bankrupt private merchants, and most damningly, create a culture of dependency among the poor. The man put in charge of the British Treasury's response to the famine was Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan was the very personification of this ideology. He was a man of immense administrative talent, discipline, and moral certainty. He was also profoundly prejudiced against the Irish, whom he viewed as a lazy, rebellious, and morally deficient people. In his mind, the famine was not a tragedy to be alleviated, but an act of divine providence, an opportunity sent by God to punish Irish indolence, and to modernize its backward agricultural system through the cleansing fire of starvation. Any significant government aid, he believed, would only impede this necessary, if painful, transformation. The fate of millions of people now rested in the hands of a man who believed their suffering was a solution, not a problem. As the catastrophic failure of the 1846 harvest became clear, the government abandoned Peel's policy of food importation. Their primary relief effort was to be a system of public works. The idea was that the starving Irish should not be given charity, but should work for any aid they received. Starving men, women, and even children were put to work building roads, often in the most remote locations, roads that went from nowhere to nowhere. They were paid a pittance, often not enough to feed a single person, let alone a family. The system was a bureaucratic nightmare. The men, their bodies already wasted by hunger, would expend their last reserves of energy doing pointless, back-breaking labor in the freezing cold of winter. They would collapse and die on the roadsides, their shovels still in their hands. The winter of 1846 and the year that followed became known in the Irish memory as Black 47. It was the lowest circle of hell. With no potatoes left, and with other food either too expensive or being shipped out of the country for profit, the people began to starve en masse. Eyewitness accounts from the period are a litany of horrors. Visitors described seeing people walking the roads who looked like living skeletons, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollowed out by hunger. Children's cries for food slowly faded to whimpers as their strength gave out. Entire families would shut themselves into their small, one-room cabins, lying down together to await death. The landscape became silent, the usual sounds of rural life replaced by an eerie quiet. And with starvation came its inseparable companion, disease. Typhus, spread by lice, became rampant. Dysentery, which the people called the bloody flux, swept through the weakened population. Relapsing fever, carried by the same lice as typhus, caused high fevers and intense jaundice. These diseases, not direct starvation, were the biggest killers. The country was turned into a vast, open-air hospital, with no doctors and no medicine. The most galling aspect of the tragedy was that Ireland was not without food. Throughout the famine years, vast quantities of food, wheat, oats, barley, and livestock were being exported from Irish ports to England. This was private property, belonging to landlords and large farmers, and in the logic of laissez-faire, the government had no right to interfere. The starving Irish would watch, powerless, as carts laden with grain and herds of cattle made their way to the ports, often under the protection of armed British soldiers, to be shipped away to feed the very country whose government refused to feed them. As tenants fell deeper into starvation, they were unable to pay the rent on their small plots of land. For the landlords, the famine became an opportunity to clear their estates of the small, unprofitable tenant farms and consolidate the land for more profitable cattle grazing. The era of mass evictions began. Landlords' agents, often with a detachment of constabulary, would arrive at a village and forcibly eject families from their homes. To ensure they would not return, the cabins, made of mud and stone, were often leveled, their thatched roofs set ablaze. Thousands of families, including the elderly, the sick, and small children, were cast out onto the roadsides with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. For those who survived the starvation, the disease, and the evictions, the only hope left was escape. A tide of desperate humanity began to flow towards the ports. They sought passage on any vessel that would take them, primarily to British North America and the United States. The ships they boarded were often cargo vessels, ill-suited for carrying human passengers. They were packed into dark, cramped holds, with inadequate provision of food, water, or sanitation. Disease, which was already rampant on shore, found a perfect incubator in these squalid, overcrowded conditions. Typhus, or ship fever, would tear through the passenger. These vessels became known as coffin ships. Many died during the long Atlantic crossing. Those who survived often arrived at their destination sick and destitute. Quarantine stations, like Grosse-Île in Quebec, were quickly overwhelmed. Thousands of Irish immigrants died in the fever sheds on the island, never setting foot in the new world for which they had sacrificed everything. Those who did make it ashore faced prejudice and hardship, crammed into the slums of cities like Boston, New York, and Liverpool. But they formed the foundation of the great Irish diaspora, a global community forever shaped by the memory of the hunger. The blight returned in 1847, but the harvest was small as few had had the strength or the seed potatoes to plant. It returned again in 1848 and 1849, but by then the worst of the damage was done. When the famine finally subsided, the island of Ireland was changed forever. Out of a population of over 8 million, at least 1 million people had died from starvation and disease. Another million had emigrated. The landscape was littered with the ruins of abandoned villages, the cut chans, their stone walls crumbling back into the earth. The Irish language, which had been the tongue of the rural poor, was dealt a mortal blow. Its speakers were the ones who had died or emigrated in the greatest numbers. The Great Hunger is not remembered in Ireland as a purely natural disaster. It is remembered as a catastrophe, made infinitely worse by a political and economic ideology that valued abstract market principles over human life. It left a legacy of deep and abiding bitterness towards British rule, fueling the cause of Irish nationalism for generations to come. It was a trauma etched into the soul of the nation, a silent wound passed down through families. It was a famine that occurred in one of the richest empires in the world, a tragedy of starvation in a land of plenty. It was a story of a people brought to their knees, and how their suffering and their resilience in the face of it would reshape not only their own island, but the world.